The air in the Blackthorn estate was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and cold dread as Viktor Blackthorn, the man the underworld whispered of as the Black Lotus, stood rigid before his floor-to-ceiling mirror. A man who had dismantled empires with a whisper, Viktor now found his hands trembling as he adjusted a silk tie that felt like a noose. Behind him stood a small, silent figure, 7-year-old Alexander. The boy's simple, cotton shirt was a jarring stain of innocence against the backdrop of Viktor's polished obsidian world. For decades, Viktor had ruled by a single, blood-soaked decree. Love is a liability. Children are a death sentence. All the wealth he had accumulated, the high-caliber weapons in his safe, and the thousands of men at his command meant nothing in the face of this 7-year-old boy. His guns could not threaten the boy's fear into disappearing. His money could not bribe the rival syndicates into ignoring his sudden weakness. In this grand, cold room, the most powerful man in the city was utterly helpless. Everything Viktor had built was at risk because of a child he never wanted. But while the boy looked up with wide, hopeful eyes, seeking a father's warmth, Viktor wasn't looking for a way to protect him. He was looking for the quickest way to kill the boy's heart. He did what no father should dare to attempt, what most men would consider an act of evil. To save the boy from his enemies, Viktor decided he would have to turn the child into a reflection of himself. But as the training began, a darker secret loomed over the estate. Viktor didn't just hate the boy's innocence, he feared it. Because 15 years ago, Viktor was that same boy, and the man who had broken him to take over the throne was his own father. The heavy silence of the Blackthorn estate was usually a sign of Viktor's absolute control, but tonight, it felt like a suffocating shroud. Viktor stood before the antique mahogany mirror in his dressing room, his reflection staring back with eyes that had seen too much blood and felt too little remorse. He adjusted his cufflinks with clinical precision, each movement a practiced shield against the chaos of the world. But as he looked into the glass, his gaze drifted downward to the small, trembling reflection standing 3 feet behind him. Alexander. The boy had been in the house for less than 24 hours, yet he had already dismantled the cold sanctuary Viktor had spent decades building. The child was a ghost of a life Viktor had long ago buried, a reminder of a woman he had once allowed himself to love, and a vulnerability he had sworn to excise. Alexander stood perfectly still, his small hands clutching the hem of a simple, faded tattered shirt that looked like a scar against the opulence of the room. He didn't speak. He only watched Viktor with a mixture of desperate longing and paralyzing fear. "Stop fidgeting," Viktor said, his voice like grinding stones. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He could feel the boy's heart beating from across the room, a frantic rhythm that irritated his nerves. "I'm sorry, sir," the boy whispered. The word "sir" cut deeper than any blade. Alexander didn't call him father. He didn't know how. He only knew that this towering, dark-suited man held the power of life and death in his narrowed eyes. Viktor finally turned, his shadow swallowing the boy whole. He walked toward Alexander, the soles of his handmade Italian shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble floor, a sound that usually signaled an execution. He stopped inches from the child and reached down, his large, calloused hand hovering near the boy's face. Alexander flinched, his eyes squeezing shut as he braced for a blow. Viktor paused. He saw the way the boy's eyelashes fluttered and the way his small shoulders hunched. It was a mirror of a moment 30 years prior, when Viktor had stood in this very room, flinching before his own father's shadow. A surge of disgust rose in his throat, not for the boy, but for the weakness that innocence represented. "In this house," Viktor murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous low, "fear is a choice. And it is a choice that will get you killed." He reached out and gripped the boy's chin, forcing Alexander to look up into his cold, unforgiving eyes. He saw himself in those pupils, the same shape, the same depth, but there was no cruelty there yet. Only a soft, terrifying light. "You have my blood, Alexander," Viktor said, his grip tightening just enough to be felt. But blood is not enough to survive the Blackthorns. To stay in this world, You must learn to be the shadow, not the one hiding in it. As Viktor turned back to the mirror, he saw the boy's reflection again. The innocence was still there, but beneath it, a tiny spark of resolve began to flicker. Viktor felt a chill. He had never wanted a son, but now that fate had delivered one, he realized the task ahead of him was more brutal than any war he had ever fought. He wasn't just raising a child. He was preparing to kill the only thing in the world that made him feel human. The decision had been made before the sun even cleared the horizon. Viktor sat in his study, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and gun oil, watching a black sedan idle in the driveway. He would send the boy to a secluded estate in the Swiss Alps, a gilded cage where Alexander could live out a quiet, unremarkable life far from the reach of the Blackthorn name. It was the closest thing to mercy Viktor had ever offered. He told himself it wasn't about the flinch in the mirror or the boy's hauntingly familiar eyes. It was a tactical removal of a strategic vulnerability. "The car is ready, boss," Marcus whispered from the doorway, his hand resting habitually on the grip of his sidearm. Viktor didn't look up from his desk. "Pack his things. He takes nothing that belongs to this house. Just the clothes he arrived in." He heard the soft, hesitant footsteps of the boy approaching. Alexander stood at the threshold of the study, looking smaller than he had the night before. He held a tattered drawing in his hand, a shaky sketch of the garden fountain, as if he wanted to offer a piece of himself before being discarded again. Viktor's gaze remained fixed on the ledger in front of him, his heart a locked vault. He could not afford to see the hope in those eyes, not when he was about to extinguish it. "Go," Viktor commanded, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the window panes. "The driver will take you to your new home. Do not look back." Alexander's lower lip trembled, the drawing fluttering to the floor as his spirit finally broke. He turned to leave, his small shoulders shaking with a silent sob that irritated Viktor more than a siren's wail. But the boy didn't reach the door. A sudden, deafening roar shattered the morning stillness. The lead-lined windows of the study exploded inward, showering the room in a rain of glass diamonds. Viktor was off his feet in a heartbeat, his instincts overriding his cold resolve. He didn't think, he moved. He lunged across the room, his heavy frame shielding Alexander as a second explosion rocked the foundation of the house. The Red Fong Syndicate had arrived. The high-pitched whine of suppressed submachine guns chewed through the mahogany doors. "The boy," a voice rasped from the hallway. "The Don wants the Black Lotus to watch his legacy burn." Viktor pressed Alexander into the knee-hole of his massive desk, his body a wall of iron and wool. He pulled a sleek, black handgun from a hidden holster, his eyes turning into chips of flint. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. There was no Swiss Alps. There was no escape. By simply existing, Alexander had been drafted into the war. The enemies of the Black Lotus didn't care about innocence. They only cared about leverage. Viktor looked down at the boy, who was curled into a ball, his face pale with terror. The protocol had changed. He could no longer send the boy away to safety, because safety no longer existed for a Blackthorn. "Look at me," Viktor hissed, grabbing Alexander's chin as bullets tore through the books on the shelves behind them. The boy's eyes found his, wide and searching. "The world is trying to kill you, Alexander. From this moment on, you stop being a child. You are a weapon. Do you understand?" Through the smoke and the smell of cordite, Alexander nodded, a slow, jagged movement. The innocence didn't vanish, but it retreated, hidden behind a mask of shock. Viktor stood up, his weapon leveled at the door, finally accepting the grim reality. He wouldn't save his son by hiding him. He would save him by making him the most dangerous thing in the room. The game had begun. The smoke from the Red Fong attack had barely cleared from the hallways before the transformation of the Blackthorn estate began. The colorful drawings Alexander had made were swept into the fireplace, their edges curling into black ash under Viktor's cold gaze. In their place came topographical maps, schematics of security grids, and the heavy, metallic scent of gun oil that now permeated the boy's bedroom. Viktor had realized that mercy was a luxury they had burned through. Survival now required a systematic stripping of the boy's spirit. A soldier does not look at the face, Viktor stated, his voice echoing in the private basement range. He stood behind Alexander, whose small hands were visible beneath the weight of a deactivated training pistol. The boy's arms shook, the heavy steel a cruel substitute for the stuffed bear he had cried for only 2 nights ago. The face holds a story. Stories create hesitation. Hesitation is the moment the bullet finds you. But what if they're scared too? Alexander whispered, his voice small and cracking. Viktor stepped forward, his shadow falling over the boy like a physical weight. He didn't offer a comforting touch. Instead, he reached out and adjusted Alexander's grip, his fingers like iron bands. If they are scared, they are dangerous. If they are dangerous, they must be neutralized. There is no what if in this house, Alexander. There is only the objective. The lessons move from the physical to the psychological. In the afternoons, Viktor sat across from the boy in the dim study, playing games of chess where the pieces weren't wood, but representations of real-world assets. He taught the 7-year-old how to identify a lie by the pulse in a man's neck, how to find the structural weakness in a building, and how to go an entire day without speaking a word. Viktor watched with a grim, hidden pride as the light in Alexander's eyes began to dim, replaced by a haunting, precocious stillness. One evening, Viktor found Alexander staring at the empty shelf where his toy soldiers used to stand. The boy didn't cry. He simply stood there, his posture rigid, mimicking the disciplined stance Viktor maintained. When Alexander noticed his father in the doorway, he didn't run to him for a hug. He simply clicked his heels together and nodded. "The perimeter is secure, sir," the boy said, his voice devoid of the melodic lilt of childhood. Viktor felt a sharp, jagged pang of something resembling regret, but he crushed it instantly. He saw the way Alexander's small jaw was beginning to set in a permanent line of tension, the Blackthorn jaw. He was forging a successor, a shield, a monster that would be capable of surviving the wolves at the door. Viktor knew he was killing the son he never wanted, but as the boy looked at him with eyes that were becoming as cold as the lead on the table, Viktor realized the tragedy of their bond. To keep Alexander alive, he had to make sure the boy had nothing left to live for but the war. The transition from child to soldier was not a clean break, but a slow, jagged tearing of the soul. Despite the cold weight of the training pistol and the sterile logic of the maps, a small, stubborn part of Alexander still clung to the memory of the father he had imagined before he ever stepped foot in the Blackthorn estate. He watched Viktor from the shadows of the hallways, a man of iron and obsidian who never laughed, never lingered, and never looked back. To Alexander, Viktor was a mountain he had to climb, not just to survive, but to be seen. One rainy Tuesday, the lessons were cut short by an emergency shipment at the docks. Viktor was preparing to leave, his long black coat billowing behind him like the wings of a predatory bird. Alexander, standing by the grand staircase, felt a sudden, desperate surge of the boy he used to be. He wasn't thinking of strategy or the Black Lotus protocol. He was thinking of the hollow ache in his chest that no amount of lead could fill. "Sir," Alexander called out, his voice cracking through the practiced discipline of his training. Viktor stopped, his hand on the heavy brass handle of the front door. He did not turn. "The perimeter report is not due for another hour, Alexander. Go back to the study." "It's not about the report," Alexander said, his footsteps echoing as he ran across the marble floor. He stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving. In his hand, he held a small, crumpled object he had managed to hide from the cleaners, a silver locket that had belonged to his mother, containing a blurred photo of a younger, softer Viktor. "I found this. You looked happy here. With her. With me." Alexander reached out, his small fingers trembling as he offered the trinket. It was a bridge made of silver and hope, an invitation for the boss to step back and the father to step forward. For a heartbeat, the silence in the foyer was absolute. Viktor looked down at the locket, his jaw tightening until the muscle pulsed. The ghost of a memory flickered in his eyes, a flash of a life where love wasn't a death sentence. Then, the shutter slammed shut. Viktor didn't take the locket. Instead, he struck it out of the boy's hand with a swift, brutal flick of his wrist. The silver clattered across the floor, sliding into the dark shadows beneath the console table. "That man is dead," Viktor hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. He stepped into Alexander's space, looming over him until the boy had to strain his neck to see his father's face. "The woman in that picture is dead because she thought love would protect her. And you will be dead by the end of the week if you keep looking for a father in a house of executioners." Alexander flinched, his eyes brimming with the tears he had been taught to despise. "Don't you dare cry," Viktor commanded, his gaze as sharp as a scalpel. "Tears are just blood you aren't brave enough to spill. If you ever mention that photo again, I will burn it. If you ever look for happiness again, I will find a successor who understands that a blackthorn has no room for a heart." Viktor turned and walked out into the rain, the heavy door thudding shut with the finality of a tombstone. Alexander stood alone in the vast, cold hall. He didn't chase after the car. He didn't go back for the locket. He simply wiped his eyes with the back of a hand that was already starting to callous, the last flicker of the child dying in the dark. He didn't want a father anymore. He realized now that to survive Viktor Blackthorn, he would have to become something even more heartless than the man who had just broken him. The war for the city's soul did not take place in the shadows of back alleys, but in the sterile, high-altitude silence of the Red Fang's high-rise sanctuary. Viktor Blackthorn sat in a velvet armchair, surrounded by the enemy's men, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. He had come under the guise of a ceasefire negotiation, but the air in the room was electric with the threat of a trap. Across from him sat Silas Vane, a man whose smile was as jagged and artificial as a broken bottle. "You look tired, Black Lotus," Silas purred, swirling a glass of amber liquid. "The weight of the crown is heavy, but the weight of a legacy, that must be unbearable." Viktor's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't come here for a psychological evaluation, Silas. You broke the pact when you targeted my estate. Give me the territory you promised, or I'll turn this skyscraper into a tomb." Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He leaned forward, tapping a rhythmic beat on the mahogany table. "We both know you're not here for the docks or the drug routes. You're here because you're terrified. For years, we couldn't find a single crack in your armor. You were the man who had nothing to lose, which made you the man no one could beat. But then, a little bird dropped a boy on your doorstep." Viktor's jaw tightened, a subtle shift that did not escape Silas's predatory eyes. "The boy is a tool. Nothing more." "A tool? Is that what you call him?" Silas's grin widened, revealing a row of perfectly capped teeth. "I've heard the rumors, Viktor. I've heard about the lessons in lead. I've heard how you're trying to build a monster. It's poetic, really. You're trying so hard to kill the boy's heart because you're afraid yours is starting to beat again. You think if you turn him into a stone, he can't be used against you. But you're forgetting one thing." Silas pulled a grain of old, yellowed newsprint from his pocket and slid it across the table. It was a report from 30 years ago, a house fire, a missing child, and the brutal execution of a minor Mafia lieutenant. "I knew your father, Viktor," Silas whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "I saw him break you. I saw the way you looked at him with those same big, pathetic eyes Alexander has now. You hate that boy because he is a mirror. You see your own weakness staring back at you every morning. You're not raising a successor. You're trying to murder your own past. But you've made a mistake. By bringing him into this world, you've given me a target that hurts you more than any bullet." Viktor stood up, his presence suddenly filling the room with a suffocating, lethal gravity. The guards leveled their rifles, but he didn't even glance at them. He looked only at Silas. "The difference between my father and me," Viktor said, his voice a low, terrifying growl, "is that he broke me to keep me under his thumb. I am breaking Alexander to make sure he is the one holding the hammer. If you ever mention my past, or my son, again, I won't just kill you. I will erase every trace that you ever existed." Viktor turned and walked out, his stride steady, but inside, the armor was cracking. Silas's laughter followed him down the hall, a haunting reminder that the Black Lotus was no longer invisible. He had a soft spot, and now, The entire underworld knew exactly where to aim. The training grounds were situated in a converted warehouse on the edge of the Blackthorn estate, a place where the air tasted of copper and cold exhaust. Viktor stood on the observation catwalk, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the small figure below navigate a labyrinth of plywood walls and pop-up targets. Alexander moved with a mechanical precision that should have satisfied Viktor, but the boy's eyes remained wide, reflecting a lingering terror that no amount of repetition could erase. "Faster, Alexander." Viktor's voice boomed through the overhead speakers, stripped of any warmth. "The world doesn't wait for you to catch your breath." The exercise was simple, a simulated extraction under fire using non-lethal, high-velocity paint rounds. But as Alexander rounded the final corner, the mechanical pulley system that operated the targets malfunctioned. A heavy steel arm, designed to swing a silhouette into view, snapped its tension cable. Instead of a target, a 300-pound slab of reinforced metal came hurtling toward the boy like a guillotine. Alexander moved. Viktor roared, but for the first time in weeks, the boy froze. The Black Lotus protocol vanished, replaced by the paralyzed instinct of a 7-year-old facing certain death. Viktor didn't think. He didn't calculate the risk to his dignity or his posture. He vaulted over the catwalk railing, a 15-foot drop that would have shattered a lesser man's knees. He hit the concrete in a roll and lunged forward, his coat snapping like a whip. He tackled Alexander just as the steel arm whistled through the space where the boy's head had been a microsecond before. They skidded across the gritty floor, Viktor's heavy frame taking the brunt of the impact against a support pillar. For a moment, the only sound in the warehouse was the frantic, jagged breathing of the child pinned beneath him. Viktor felt the small, rapid thrum of Alexander's heart against his own chest, a rhythmic reminder of the vulnerability he claimed to despise. Viktor looked down, his face inches from the boy's. Alexander's eyes were filled with tears, but he wasn't looking at the steel arm. He was looking at Viktor with a shocked, desperate realization. You caught me," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Viktor's first instinct was to snarl, to berate the boy for freezing, to re-establish the wall of ice between them. His shoulder throbbed where it had slammed into the pillar, and his hand was scraped raw. He started to pull away, but as he looked at the boy's pale face, his fingers didn't recoil. Instead, they lingered for a fraction of a second on Alexander's shoulder, not a grip of iron, but a touch that was almost, for one fleeting moment, protective. "I told you," Viktor rasped, his voice strangely thick as he forced himself to stand, pulling the boy up with him. He straightened his suit, the Black Lotus mask sliding back into place, though his hands still shook slightly. "In this house, we don't allow anything to be destroyed unless I give the order. Not even you." He turned away quickly, hiding the fact that his own heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with the fall. He had saved the boy to preserve his legacy, he told himself. But as he walked toward the exit, the ghost of that small heartbeat stayed with him, a silent confession that the monster he was building still had a father, whether he wanted to be one or not. The warehouse incident had left an unspoken fracture in the air between them. Viktor sat in the darkness of his private gallery, the only light emanating from a single spotlight aimed at a tattered, ancient scroll depicting a black lotus rising from stagnant, oily water. He didn't turn when he heard the hesitant shuffle of Alexander's footsteps. The boy didn't stay back tonight. He walked until he stood just at the edge of Viktor's shadow, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You want to know why they call me the Black Lotus?" Viktor said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull the shadows closer. It wasn't a question. Alexander looked up, his young face etched with a gravity that no child should possess. "Silas said it was because you have no heart, that you were broken." Viktor's mouth twisted into a ghost of a bitter smile. He reached out and slowly unbuttoned his left cufflink, rolling back his sleeve to reveal a series of jagged, vertical white lines that ran from his wrist to his elbow, scars that weren't born from a rival's blade, but from something far more intimate. "A lotus is a flower that grows in the deepest, most suffocating mud," Viktor began, his eyes locked on the scroll. "My father, your grandfather, believed that a man was like that flower. He thought that if life was too easy, the man would be soft, colorful, and easily crushed. So, he made sure my life was the mud. He didn't just train me, Alexander. He tried to drown me in the dark. He sat back, the leather of his chair creaking like a warning. When I was 10, he left me in a basement for a week with nothing but a knife and a choice: starve or kill the hound he had given me as a companion. He told me that love was the mud that kept the lotus from reaching the surface. He called me black because I was the only thing that survived his darkness. I became the flower that thrived on the filth he poured over me. Alexander reached out, his small hand hovering just inches from the scars on Viktor's arm before he pulled back, afraid. Did you hate him? I hated him until I realized he was right about one thing, Viktor said, finally turning to look the boy in the eye. The coldness was there, but for the first time, it was laced with a haunting transparency. The world is the mud, Alexander. It is thick, and it is hungry. If I leave you soft, the mud will swallow you whole. I am not breaking you because I want to see you suffer. I am breaking you so that when the world tries to drown you, you will already know how to breathe underwater. The boy looked at the scars, then at his own small, unblemished hands. The realization of the inheritance settled over him, a legacy not of gold or titles, but of survival through mutilation. Viktor saw the flicker of understanding in the boy's eyes, a bridge of shared trauma that connected them more deeply than any bloodline. I don't want to be a lotus, Alexander whispered, his voice small but steady. Neither did I, Viktor replied, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. But in this family, we don't get to choose what we are. We only choose whether we survive it. He rolled his sleeve back down, hiding the scars once more, but the image remained burned into Alexander's mind. The lesson for the night wasn't about lead or strategy. It was about the cost of the crown. As Viktor watched the boy walk away, he realized that by telling the truth, he had passed on the heaviest burden of all, the knowledge that the man who loved him most would be the one to hurt him worst. The Blackthorn annual gala was a sea of shimmering silk, sharp tuxedos, and forced smiles, a high-stakes theater where the city's elite paid homage to the Black Lotus. Viktor stood on the mezzanine, his gaze sweeping the ballroom with the predatory focus of a hawk. Beneath him, Alexander stood near the refreshment table, dressed in a miniature version of Viktor's charcoal suit. The boy looked poised, his back straight, and his expression masked in the cold stillness Viktor had beaten into him. He was a perfect Blackthorn, a masterpiece of iron and ice. He's a credit to your name, Viktor, a senator murmured, stepping into his periphery. He has your eyes. The eyes of a man who knows exactly what he's worth. Viktor nodded curtly, his pride a cold, distant thing. But as he looked back toward the table, the boy was gone. It happened in the span of a heartbeat. A waiter dropped a tray of crystal flutes, the shattering glass creating a momentary, glittering distraction. In that flicker of time, the space where Alexander had been standing was empty. Viktor's pulse, usually a steady, low hum, spiked into a frantic thud. He scanned the crowd, his eyes cutting through the gowns and the diamonds. Nothing. Then, he saw it. The heavy velvet curtains near the service exit settling back into place. Viktor didn't excuse himself. He moved with a sudden, violent grace that knocked the senator aside. He reached the service hallway just as the tires of a black van shrieked against the pavement of the loading dock. A single, crumpled piece of paper lay on the concrete, a drawing of a lotus Alexander had been sketching in secret, now smeared with a greasy tire track. For the first time in his adult life, Viktor Blackthorn felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't the panic of a lost asset or the frustration of a strategic failure. It was a raw, visceral agony that ripped through the center of his being. He had spent months convincing himself that the boy was a burden, a target, a liability to be hardened or discarded. He had told himself that he was building a monster to protect his legacy. But as he stared at the empty street, the silence of the night felt like a physical weight crushing his chest. He realized that the protocol had failed because he had lied to himself. Alexander wasn't the mud. He was the only thing that had ever been clean in Viktor's world. The boy wasn't just a successor. He was the only heartbeat Viktor had left. "Marcus!" Viktor roared, his voice cracking the night air, stripped of its calculated chill. His men scrambled, their faces pale at the sight of the Black Lotus coming undone. "Seal the city. Every bridge, every tunnel, every sewer. If a single hair on his head is harmed, I will burn this entire state to ash." He climbed into his own car, his hands gripping the steering wheel until the leather groaned. The fear he had tried to kill in Alexander had found its way home. Viktor wasn't the boss tonight, and he wasn't the Lotus. He was a father, and he realized with terrifying clarity that if he lost the boy, he wouldn't just be losing a legacy. He would be losing his soul. The city was a blur of neon and rain as Viktor drove with a lethal, focused desperation. He didn't use sirens. The roar of his engine and the terrifying reputation of the Black Lotus cleared the path well enough. Every contact he had ever bribed, every snitch he had ever spared, and every soldier he had ever trained was now a sensor in a vast, panicked grid. When the word finally came, an abandoned shipyard on the southern edge of the harbor, Viktor didn't wait for his backup. He arrived like a force of nature, his car skidding to a halt amidst the rusting skeletons of old freighters. He stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped, a suppressed submachine gun in one hand and a combat knife in the other. He moved through the shadows of the warehouse not like a man, but like the vengeful ghost his father had spent decades conjuring. He tore through the perimeter guards with a cold, silent efficiency that left no room for mercy. His heart was a drum of war, but his mind was a desert of ice. When he finally kicked in the doors to the central office, his finger was already tightening on the trigger. But the scene inside brought him to a dead, trembling halt. Silas Vane was on the floor, clutching a jagged wound in his thigh, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. Standing over him, illuminated by a flickering industrial bulb, was Alexander. The boy's tuxedo was torn, and his face was smeared with grease and blood, but his posture was terrifyingly steady. In his small hands, he held Silas's own discarded ivory-handled pistol. His eyes weren't filled with the wide-eyed terror of the gala. They were flat, dark, and hollow, exact replicas of Viktor's. "I did what you said, sir," Alexander whispered, his voice devoid of any childhood lilt. I watched the pulse in his neck. I waited for him to hesitate. I didn't look at his face. Viktor felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the damp harbor air. He looked at Silas, who was groveling at the feet of a 7-year-old, and then back at his son. The monster he had spent months forging had arrived, but seeing it in the flesh was a different kind of horror. Alexander had used the lessons to survive. Yes, he had survived the Red Fong, but the light Viktor had glimpsed in the warehouse was gone. Viktor dropped his weapon and stepped over the wreckage toward the boy. "Alexander," he said, his voice unusually soft, almost pleading. "Put it down. It's over." The boy didn't move at first. He looked at the gun, then at the bleeding man, and finally at Viktor. A single tear tracked through the grime on his cheek, but his hand didn't shake. "If I put it down, will they come back for me?" "No," Viktor promised, reaching out and gently covering the boy's hands with his own, tilting the barrel away from Silas. "I'm here now." The shadow is gone. As the gun clicked onto the floor, Alexander finally collapsed, the iron mask shattering as he fell into Viktor's arms. Viktor held him tight, the boy's small frame shaking with delayed shock. He had saved his son's life, but as he looked at the cold, empty stare Alexander had given Silas, Viktor realized with a sickening gut punch that he had succeeded too well. He had won the war, but he was losing the boy he had finally realized was his heart. The warehouse was surrounded. The sirens of the Red Fong reinforcements wailed in the distance, a rising tide of violence that threatened to drown the shipyard. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of iron and the heavy, humid heat of the harbor. Viktor stood in the center of the wreckage, holding Alexander's trembling frame, but the boy's eyes remained fixed on Silas Vane. The rival boss was crawling toward a discarded rifle, his fingers clawing at the concrete. "Finish it, Alexander," Silas hissed, his voice a ragged, desperate goad. "Your father didn't teach you to be a victim. He taught you to be like him. Do it, or I'll find you in your sleep. I'll be the shadow under your bed for the rest of your life." Alexander's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol on the floor. His small face was a mask of agonizing conflict. The child who wanted to be safe versus the monster who had been taught that safety only came through blood. He looked up at Viktor, his eyes searching for the one thing he had never truly received: a choice. Viktor felt the weight of 30 years of trauma pressing down on his shoulders. He saw his own father's face in the flickering light, the man who had watched him kill the hound, the man who had cheered when Viktor finally became a Black Lotus. If Alexander pulled that trigger now, the boy would survive the night, and the Blackthorn legacy would be secured for another generation. Alexander would be the ultimate weapon, a king of shadows who feared nothing. But as Viktor looked at the boy's small, blood-streaked hand reaching for the steel, he saw the end of the son he had finally learned to love. If Alexander fired, the Black Lotus would live, but the boy would die. "No," Viktor whispered. He stepped over the gun, his heavy boot pinning the weapon to the floor. He turned his back on Silas, an act of such profound tactical negligence that it went against every lesson he had ever taught. He reached down and picked Alexander up, tucking the boy's head into the crook of his neck, shielding his eyes. "Sir." Alexander's voice was muffled against Viktor's coat, small and confused. "He's getting the rifle. You told me. You told me never to hesitate." "I lied," Viktor rasped, his voice breaking for the first time in his life. Behind them, Silas's fingers closed around the rifle. Viktor didn't reach for his own weapon. He didn't calculate the trajectory. He simply turned his body, using his own back as a human shield, bracing for the impact that would protect the boy's innocence rather than his inheritance. "The lesson is over, Alexander," Viktor murmured, his grip tightening as the first shot echoed through the hollow warehouse. "You aren't a weapon. You're my son." In that moment of absolute vulnerability, the Black Lotus withered. Viktor didn't care about the territory or the crown. He only cared about the small heartbeat against his chest. He had spent a lifetime building a monster, but in the final confrontation, he chose to be a father, even if it meant he would be the last Blackthorn to ever hold the hammer. The transition did not happen with a grand announcement or a final explosion. It happened in the quiet, sterile recovery wing of a private clinic, far from the smoke of the shipyard. Viktor sat by Alexander's bed, his arm in a sling and his chest bound in bandages, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his son's chest. The Black Lotus was dead, buried under the rubble of the warehouse where Viktor had chosen a child's life over a criminal's throne. He had surrendered his territories to Marcus and brokered a permanent exile for himself, trading his empire for the simple, terrifying right to be a father. "Are we going home, sir?" Alexander's voice was a mere whisper when he finally woke, his eyes searching Viktor's face for the cold mask he had grown to expect. Viktor reached out with his good hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from the boy's forehead. The touch was no longer clinical or corrective. It was steady and warm. "Not to that house, Alexander. We're going somewhere the shadows don't reach. Somewhere you can forget the weight of a gun." The boy looked at his father's bandaged shoulder, the physical proof of the night the monster had failed and the man had triumphed. "But you said the world is the mud. You said I had to be a lotus to survive it." Viktor leaned in, his voice dropping to a soft, jagged tone that held the weight of a hard-won truth. "I was wrong. The mud is real, but you don't have to grow in it alone. I spent my life thinking that power was the ability to destroy anything that made me weak. But true power, the kind I want you to have, is the strength to protect what makes you human." In the weeks that followed, the Blackthorn name faded from the headlines of the underworld. The Black Lotus became a ghost story told by men who still lived by the blade. Meanwhile, in a small coastal town 3,000 miles away, a man and a boy began the slow, painful process of unlearning. Viktor replaced the topographical maps with art supplies and the lessons in lead with lessons in patience. He watched as the hollow stare in Alexander's eyes was slowly replaced by the light of a childhood restored. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and amber, Alexander stood on the beach holding a new sketch, not of a weapon or a security grid, but of the two of them standing together. He didn't flinch when Viktor approached. He didn't click his heels or report on the perimeter. He simply leaned against his father's side, the silence between them no longer a shroud, but a bridge. Viktor looked down at his son and realized the cycle was finally broken. The scars on his arms remained, but they were no longer a blueprint for the boy's future. He had dismantled an empire to save a soul, and as he watched Alexander laugh at the incoming tide, he knew he had finally achieved the one thing his own father never could. He had found a power that didn't require a monster to wield it. The legacy of blood had ended, and for the first time in his life, Viktor Blackthorn was at peace. The legacy of the Blackthorn family was no longer written in blood on the streets, but in the quiet, steady pulse of a life lived with purpose. Years later, Viktor Blackthorn passed away, not from a rival's bullet or a traitor's blade, but peacefully in his sleep, his hand resting on a worn sketch of a lotus flower. At his funeral, there were no armored cars or silent, menacing men in dark glasses. Instead, there was only a tall, broad-shouldered young man named Alexander, who stood before his father's grave with eyes that were clear, kind, and entirely his own. Alexander did not inherit a criminal empire. He inherited a foundation that built schools and hospitals in the very neighborhoods his ancestors had once torn apart. He grew into a man who led with empathy rather than fear, proving that the shadows of our fathers do not have to become our own. He lived by a truth his father had died to teach him, that the greatest strength isn't found in the power to take a life, but in the courage to heal one. The cycle of the monster had finally been broken, replaced by the enduring light of a son who chose to be a man of peace, proving that even the darkest roots can give rise to a flower that truly belongs to the sun. The moral lesson of the Blackthorn legacy. The story of Viktor and Alexander leaves us with a profound truth. Our past may shape us, but it does not have to define us. Viktor spent his life believing that hardening a heart was the only way to survive a cruel world, yet he discovered that true survival is found in vulnerability and love. He learned that breaking a cycle of violence requires a sacrifice greater than any war, the sacrifice of one's own pride and ego. For Alexander, the lesson was one of identity. He proved that no matter how much lead is forced into a soul, the human spirit has an inherent capacity for light. We are not merely the products of our upbringing or the inheritance of our parents' mistakes. We are the sum of the choices we make when we finally stand before our own mirror. Strength is not the absence of emotion, but the mastery of it to do good. In the end, the Black Lotus didn't just represent a man who survived the mud. It represented the hope that any of us can rise above our circumstances to bloom into something better.